the last day of the Painting the Wilderness challenge, and I am sad and also so excited to paint this last project with you. We're going to try to capture the elusive Aurora Borealis in a simple and doable but still really magical painting. So, are you coming? Welcome to day 10. Can you believe it? We're at the end of my Painting the Wilderness 10-day watercolor challenge, and I think you are really going to love the project that we are ending on. As a reminder, I am giving away a copy of my book every day during the challenge. Make sure to watch to the end of the video to figure out how to enter for today. And without further ado, let's get started with an aurora night sky. So we're painting the northern lights today, and I'm so excited. Like all the other videos, we're going to get started by prepping our watercolor notebook with some washi tape, just as a border around with extra long ends to wrap around the notebook to keep the page taut while we're painting in the notebook. And then to keep the pages even extra taut, I'm going to put some binder clips on the sides. That's just to kind of minimize warping, although especially with a project like this, where we're going to have a lot of really wet washes, a lot of wet paint, warping is inevitable. So if you're looking for a solution to completely eliminate warping entirely, this very few of those exist. um, anyway, we're going to start with the wet on wet technique. And first, similar to the night sky, project from day one. Honestly, it's kind of like we're circling around, closing the loop, going back to a night sky. We're going to take this sky in layers. So I'm starting with Payne's gray, but it's mixed with a little bit of Prussian blue. So it's like an indigo kind of, except not quite as dark as Payne's gray, not quite as light as Prussian blue. And I'm just kind of using a light value version of that paint and going around the edges of my paper, intentionally leaving a lot of the middle white. But I do want a nice blendy clouded effect. And so I'm using my paintbrush with clean water to just kind of like tap along in there um and keep that watercolory, cloudy, blended effect. So now I'm letting that first layer dry. And before I start painting my second layer, I know that I want to use a brilliant yellow green for the aurora. And so before I get started, I'm just going to do some swatches on my paper. I'm a big fan of using scratch paper to test the colors that you want to use before you actually put them onto your project. And that's what I'm doing. As I'm making a yellow green, which I am making with Hooker's green and lemon yellow deep, I want to get it pretty light green, and I'm having to add a lot of lemon yellow deep. That's why I'm making all these swatches, because the first one that I made wasn't quite as yellow green as I wanted. And so I just kept adding lemon yellow until I got what I wanted, and that feels pretty good to me. So I have re-wet this layer. So this is now layer two. Layer one dried completely, and I re-wet it with clean water. And now I'm doing the same technique where I'm just painting along the edges, except I'm using Payne's gray this time. It's not a very dark Payne's gray. It's fairly it's probably like, I would say, a mid value, meaning it's not super watery, but it's also not very dark. And I'm just putting it around the edges to add some depth to the blue sky, but notice that I'm being careful not to put too much of the blue into the middle of the paper. That's because we're going to put the green there for the aurora. So I just want the blue to kind of be lightly around the edges. And then I'm going to start putting in the green, starting from maybe like 2/3 down the page, where the white space is. And gently moving my brush upward in a swooping motion. So the thing about Northern Lights is that often have some kind of like dancing shape, right? You could spend all day trying to get the shape exactly right. And But especially if this is your first time painting Northern Lights, I just recommend trying to get that swooping motion to give it just a little bit of movement, but not worrying too much about where the movement is going. So I put down some yellow green, and then I also mixed in some phthalo blue, some Windsor blue, to create kind of like a turquoise green, just to accent around the yellow green. So I don't want to put it all the way on top of the yellow green because I want the light green is the star of the show, but the turquoise green is just kind of adding a little bit more depth to it. And so after I put some turquoise green and then also use some water to just kind of blend the paint upward, I'm adding a little bit more yellow green. Honestly, especially when painting Northern Lights, you're going to feel a little uncomfortable. You're going to feel like, I have no idea what the heck I'm doing here. And that's okay. The whole point, all that we're trying to do is to make the Northern Lights the star of the show, right? And we want to have a glowing effect. We want to capture luminosity, which is so, you know, beautiful with watercolor. And we know that to capture that luminous texture, we need to use a lot of water. We need to allow the white space of the paper to shine through. And so, as you're painting these Northern Lights, even as you're painting, I did that really big swooping mass to the right, and then just a little curve to the left. To add some more variation in this composition there, I am going to alternate a lot between using yellow green and um, using water. So now that I have some of the Northern Lights down, this is not the only time we're going to paint them. I'm just going to add a little bit of contrast by making some of the edges slightly darker with darker Payne's gray. And I put some of the paint in between some of the stripes of the Northern Lights, but then I don't want that to be very, very dark. And so I'm using some clean water on my paintbrush to just kind of like push it away a little bit while still leaving some of that contrasting color behind. We've talked about this before that in order to create a luminous, kind of shining, striking, glowing texture, you want wet on wet technique and you want a lot of the white paper to show through, right? But contrast is also something that helps, especially skies, look like they're positively glowing. And so, just a little bit of contrast with that dark blues, very slightly around the edges, is going to help provide that. If you find your blue encroaching, then use some clean water and just push the green into the blue a little bit more, just to push the blue out of the way. I would way rather have more green than to have the blue completely overtake it. So the reason that we painted starting from 2/3 down the page is because we're going to paint the reflection of the Northern Lights now. And so when you're painting the reflection, don't try to think about it like trying to capture it too perfectly. Just kind of loosely mimic the shape that you created at the top of the sky. But even if it doesn't look much like the original shape, that's okay. This is loose watercolor. We're just kind of trying to make it look like the sky has some northern lights in it and the water has some northern lights in it. And as long as you do that, you're golden. So we're going to let that layer dry and re-wet it with clean water. And along the bottom of the lake, I'm going to add even more contrast because the reflection is going to be a little bit more dull than the top. And then I just used water to blend that right in there. So while the sky is still wet now, I'm taking some white gouache and I'm adding some twinkling stars. Twinkling stars are probably one of my favorite things to paint. Basically, what you do is you tap in some white gouache, and then with your paintbrush and some clean water, you just kind of tap around the edges of the white gouache to make the gouache blend in, to make it look like there's like the star's light is radiating out from that spot. So I painted maybe like four of those twinkling stars, and then I started splattering on some more stars, both in the sky and along the bottom where the water is. And then I let that layer dry completely, and I splattered on some stars using the wet on dry technique. So at this point, the layer is dry and I'm splattering on some stars. I'm also in the twinkling stars going to add just one dot with the wet on dry technique to kind of pull that glow together and make it seem even brighter with that contrast of the very, very white dot on top of the glowing blended space. And then I'm going to add just a few more stars manually if I want to kind of round out the composition. The stars really don't matter that much. I mean, the stars are important, but one thing to be really aware of when you're painting Northern Lights is that the aurora is the main event, right? When the aurora is in the sky, you can actually barely even see the stars. And so I'm not trying to get tons of stars. I'm just trying to add a little bit of excitement, a little bit of magic to the sky without overtaking the effect of the shining northern lights. So now I've let that layer dry, and as you can see, I'm taking a very, very, very dark value Payne's gray so that it's almost black, and I'm painting a mountain, just a silhouette of a mountain, and I want the middle, like kind of off center, to dip. And so the left side of the mountain starts a little bit smaller and then dips down, and then the right side of the mountain goes back up and is a little bit bigger than the left side. So I've painted that mountain, and now I'm going to paint the mountain's reflection. Now, we're not going to paint the reflection like it's like the water looks like glass. The water is not very still. Instead, we're going to paint it so it's rippled. And the way that we paint this rippled reflection is basically just kind of going back and forth, intentionally leaving behind some negative space, some of that dry space underneath in the general shape of the mountain. It is so important as you're doing this. This is kind of like the scumbling technique where you're just kind of moving your paintbrush in random places, intentionally leaving behind some of that dry space, but trying to maintain some kind of shape that will reflect the top of the mountain. If you worry too much about getting the shape of the mountain exactly right, you might overwork it and kind of, make it not look as natural as it normally would in water. So don't worry too much about where you're going. And remember, if you don't really like that first try at the reflection that you did, you can always try again later. Now we're going to paint some snow on top of the mountain with just some white gouache. I'm using the dry brush technique, meaning I don't want the gouache to go on very opaque. I want to capture that some of that loose texture there. And I'm again just kind of randomly putting that snow on top, leaving behind lots of that dark space. And then I'm doing the same thing in the reflection underneath. Now, for the left side of the reflection, I started doing it with the dry brush technique, but I realized that in order for it to look more rippled, I don't really want I don't want that layer of snow to be super stark. I don't really want it to look, you know, as what's the word I'm looking for? Rough as it was on the actual mountain. And so I'm going back in with some water on the left side and just kind of reactivating it to make it a little more loose. And on the right side, making it a little more loose, a little more watery as well. And now I'm going to finish off this piece by adding some very subtle ripples into the water with very, very, very light value Prussian Payne's gray or Prussian blue. Honestly, any kind of blue, it doesn't really matter. But you can barely see the ripples there. And that's exactly what we're going for. We want to do kind of like zigzaggy strokes in the water, just in a few places, starting kind of small in that tapered spot and then getting bigger and rippling out toward the right side. This is to add texture and to make the reflection actually look like water, actually look like there are ripples and waves in the water, as opposed to just having it be an exact reflection. This is a technique that I have recently started using, and it's made such a big difference when I try to paint water. Those tiny little, very light value ripples um, make just kind of bring everything together. And we're done. That's it. I don't think that this project was quite as complicated as some of the other ones, but I wanted to end on a really fun, magical note. And I hope that you had a great time watching this tutorial. and learning how I kind of piece together these really complex, deep night skies. Reflections, especially, are some of my very favorite because they can just be so magical. And you can paint them in layers, just like we do everything else in watercolor. So let's talk about what we loved and what we learned with this Aurora project. I really loved the Twinkling Stars. I think Twinkling Stars are some of my very favorite, where you do it in two layers, right? One wet on wet layer where you kind of blend the gouache so it looks like an emanating glow with a wet on dry on top. I also loved the reflection and the water. I loved the little ripples in the water that I felt like kind of pulled the whole reflection effect together. What I learned is I wanted to make the rippling effect a little more apparent, and I learned that when you're trying to get ripples in water, you need to loosen up, right? And you need to definitely leave behind some of that white space because waves actually are formed by shadows and light. It's a combination of shadows and light. So in trying to get the ripples, make sure you leave behind that white space. I loved this project so much. I loved this challenge so much. Thank you so much for joining me. If you want a chance to win a copy of my book, leave a comment below, and I will see you next time.